When the supermodel Evelyn Nesbit married a famous millionaire, people called it a fairy tale, but it was really a horror story. Evelyn Nesbit's undeniable beauty enchanted the masses, but for one man, it inspired a chilling, deep-seated obsession. While her famous features made her the darling of the Gilded Age, her dark secrets mirrored the era's rolling undercurrents. Her story is equal parts sensational, explosive, and tragic. But despite all this, her resilience reigns supreme. Evelyn was born on Christmas Day in 1884 and had a face destined for adoration. The local paper reported on her birth with only her looks in mind, writing that she was the most beautiful baby ever born in the country. Her divine features defined her from the beginning, but it was her father who nurtured her inner dreamer. Evelyn was a daddy's girl, with her father willfully encouraging little Evelyn's love of music, dance, and fantastical stories. Looking back, he was the only man she could ever depend on. And then something terrible happened. When Evelyn was only 10 years old, her comfortable childhood came to an abrupt and tearful end. When Evelyn's father passed unexpectedly at the age of 40, he left his family in dire straits. They lost everything to his outstanding debts. From then on, the Nesbits struggled to find a home, moving constantly and living off the generosity of friends and family. Barely scraping by, her mother opened a boarding house before packing it in and moving to Philadelphia. It was here that the Nesbits' life changed forever. While walking unassumably down the street, Evelyn caught the eye of an artist. The woman admired her beauty and asked her to pose for a portrait. From then on, Evelyn's path to fame was assured. She moved to New York and quickly became a high-profile model. Her picture-perfect portrait sold anything and everything, and she even graced the covers of Vanity Fair and Harper's Bazaar. But her good fortune wouldn't last forever. Bored by the duties of modeling, Evelyn turned her eyes to the world of theater. Her childhood dreams of music and dance saw realization in the energetic lifestyle of an actress. Her first role was that of a Spanish maiden in a popular Broadway show. Although she only booked a minor role, she completely enraptured one important audience member with horrific consequences. Stanford White was the man in the crowd. He was a hotshot architect who became so consumed by Evelyn's performance that he returned to see the play over and over again. Some sources said he attended over 40 times. His adoration rapidly devolved into a possessive obsession. One thing was certain, White simply had to have her. Through his friendship with a fellow chorus girl, White arranged a meeting with Evelyn at one of the apartments he kept for a certain unsavory purpose, meeting beautiful women who were not his wife. From the outside, these rendezvous points were unassuming, but the interiors were as glamorous as the owner himself. However, Evelyn would soon learn all that glitters is not gold. When Evelyn stepped into White's luxurious apartment, she reeled with delight. Unfortunately for White, this admiration didn't extend beyond the trimmings of his gilded trap. Even a ride on his famous red velvet swing couldn't make Evelyn return White's feelings. In her own words, Evelyn described him as appalling and terribly old. After all, she was only 16 and White was a distant 48. White thought Evelyn was stunning, but one thing kept her from reaching absolute perfection: her teeth. Taking it upon himself to mold her into the ideal woman, he sent her to the dentist to fix them as he saw fit. And when it came to the expenses, well, he covered all the bills. His riches were no small matter. White's obsession with Evelyn effectively turned her into his protégé and his property. He paid for everything, moving her and her mother into a fancy apartment, and even paying for her brother's education. White spoiled her with gifts, books, piano lessons, and best of all, an introduction to the man who'd make her a star. Thanks to White, Evelyn became the iconic Gibson girl. But all these favors had a dark side. White felt that Evelyn was in his pocket, and soon he'd make her pay up. Evelyn perceived White as a rich patron and father figure, but White himself had a lurid personal agenda. Winning their trust took time, but eventually his seeming devotion and generous schemes paid off. On one occasion, he persuaded Mrs. Nesbit to visit his friends back in Pittsburgh and to trust her daughter to his care, leaving the two of them alone together. This seemingly sound plan turned into a tragic mistake. At this time, Evelyn worked the circuit non-stop, She modeled during the day and acted on Broadway in the evenings. In order to isolate her from the constant demands of her career, White invited her to a party at Madison Square Garden. But this wasn't to be a soiree of mingling celebs and fine hors d'oeuvres. It was a nightmare waiting to happen. When Evelyn arrived at the party, she quickly learned the dark truth. The place was empty. Something nefarious was afoot. He said to her, "Isn't it too bad all the others have turned us down?" He handed her a glass of champagne, and then another. The party went on with just the two of them, until Evelyn, woozy and piled with drinks, became desperately vulnerable. White led Evelyn up a secret staircase to a room she had never seen before. Small but elegant, furnished with antiques and hangings. But behind these hangings was yet another room. This one, a bedroom with a 4-poster canopy bed completely surrounded by mirrors, featured the ceiling twinkling with color-changing lights. Never had anything so shiny been so sinister. The next morning, Evelyn woke to find herself reflected in one of the many mirrors, exposed and lying naked next to Stanford White. With no memory of the night's proceedings, she let loose a blood-curdling scream. White's manipulative scheming found fruition. He had claimed her body for himself. He told her that she belonged to him now. White assured Evelyn that nothing had happened and that their relations were normal, even common. But most of all, he had told her to keep quiet, saying a girl must never talk. As a young girl faced with the power of a society figure, Evelyn felt utterly betrayed and completely powerless. She would be silent, for now. Evelyn and her family relied on White in so many ways. He had single-handedly lifted them out of poverty while also campaigning for her career. Maybe if he wanted her so badly, he'd leave his wife for her. Maybe the happy ending could be hers to keep. But despite the endless attention he threw her way, it was never Stanford White's intention to make Evelyn his bride. Cast in a musical called The Wild Rose, Evelyn captivated her audiences. Perhaps more than any other, she fascinated a strange man who attended almost every performance. His name was Mr. Monroe, and over the span of a year, he came to the theater countless times, all for the sake of Evelyn. He sat in the front row every time, and soon he hatched a dark plan to corner his obsession. Just like Stanford White, Monroe became obsessed with Evelyn. Taking a leaf out of White's book, he had one of Evelyn's castmates invite her to lunch. But when Evelyn arrived at the table, she was in for a curious introduction. Monroe dropped to his knees, cradled her skirts in his hands, and told her she was the most beautiful girl in New York. And fortunately for Monroe, Evelyn was repelled by his extravagant declarations. After that, he became desperate. Evelyn met Monroe again at a pre-show dinner, where she just so happened to sit right next to him. Of course, the seating arrangement was no coincidence, and soon she discovered why. Monroe confessed that he wasn't just one of Evelyn's many fans. His real name was Harry Kendall Thaw, a coal and railroad baron with a whopping $40 million fortune. Most girls would be in awe over such a wealthy suitor, but not Evelyn. She was already used to rich men fawning all over her, and Thaw was no different. Evelyn had no idea what she was getting into with Thaw. He was hailing from Pittsburgh and desperately wanting to fit in with the New York elite. He was also a bad boy with an apathetic disregard for the massive fortune at his disposal. But perhaps most worrisome of all was the preoccupation with Broadway actresses and their virginity. While he seemed like a typical rich scoundrel from afar, he was also unstable. Evelyn didn't know it, but Thaw was dangerous. Behind the scenes, Thaw was a madman. He placed ads in the paper, pretended to be an acting coach, and lured young girls to his home. With this demented trickery, he tormented them from their supposed sins, scalding them, whipping them, and tying them up. In his mind, he was saving them, and it was only his mother's money that saved him from press charges. With Evelyn's disregard for Thaw, she seemed on track to dodge this hypothetical bullet, and she almost did. Thaw was determined in his pursuit of Evelyn. He sent her 24 pairs of silk stockings and a grand piano, but she sent them both back, and when he proposed to her, she declined. Her heart still danced beneath Stanford White's thumb, and she hoped to keep his affection. But Stanford White, forever a ladies' man, still consorted with other young actresses. Evelyn wasn't having it, and in a tale as old as time, she set out to make him jealous. Evelyn met John Barrymore at a lavish party hosted by White himself. With his youth and wit, he was the perfect man to make White jealous. By 1902, the couple seemed inseparable. Their romance had the desired effect. White became incredibly jealous and vowed to break the new couple up. Along with Evelyn's mother, White concocted a plan to separate the lovers for good. White and Evelyn's mother hoped that they could break up Evelyn and her new beau by sending her off to boarding school. However, right before she left, Barrymore endeavored to claim the last word. He proposed to Evelyn in front of both her mother and White. However, Evelyn's response called him to the core. She said no and trotted off to boarding school. Clearly, he'd served his purpose in her plan to make White jealous. While at boarding school, Evelyn faced a severe medical emergency. She needed an appendectomy. Panicked and unable to contact Stanford White, Evelyn's mother sought the help of another rich man who maintained a soft spot for her daughter, Harry Thaw. And just like that, this devilish man was back in her life. He sent her one of the best doctors money could buy, and when she pulled through, he made her an offer too good to refuse. Thaw wanted to take Evelyn and her mother on a sweeping trip through Europe to help her relax. But as soon as the trip began, Evelyn and her mother started arguing over money. Her mother was squandering her daughter's paychecks on personal purchases. When the resulting tension became too much to bear, Evelyn's mother returned to America. Unfortunately, this left Evelyn and Thaw alone together, a recipe for disaster. One night, while visiting Paris, Thaw came to Evelyn and forcefully inquired about her relationship with Stanford White. Thaw was sure that White was guilty of something terrible, and so Evelyn told the truth about the secret room of mirrors and the night she didn't remember, the night White attacked her. Thaw's reaction to this revelation was extreme. Upon hearing how White had attacked Evelyn, Thaw immediately dissolved into a fit of tears and hysterics. He was clearly angry and upset about how White had manipulated Evelyn. However, Thaw was also strangely curious about the traumatic night. He wanted every sordid detail, and so they stayed up all night mulling over it. At first, Thaw's concern moved Evelyn, but later on, it took a dark turn. Evelyn and Thaw continued to travel the continent together, but Thaw's interest and growing obsession with Stanford White didn't let up. He was always a topic of conversation. When they landed in Germany, their lodging was an eerie Gothic castle. On one fateful night, Thaw ordered the servants away so that he and Evelyn could be alone. And that's when a real-life nightmare ensued, one that Evelyn will never forget. When Evelyn awoke, she saw Thaw standing over him with a whip in hand. Consumed by madness, he attacked her, ripped at her nightgown, and beat her. He told her to atone her for her sins and then raped her himself. The very next day, Thaw pretended as though everything was normal. When she asked to see a medic, he brought her to a professional that overlooked the deep bruises and injuries trailing every inch of her body. She knew she had to get away. When they arrived back in Paris, Evelyn hit a much-needed stroke of luck. She ran into an old friend of Stanford White's, who whisked her away from Thaw's terror and back to New York. But when she got home, she realized that she was more alone than ever. Her mother refused to see her, and White was too busy to make time. Despite being a mere 17-year-old, she worried she wasn't young enough to engage White's attention. For the next 2 years, Thaw did everything in his power to make amends for brutally attacking Evelyn. He sent her letters promising that if she married him, he'd change his ways. He sent her hundreds of flowers as an apology, and when she refused to see him, he sent friends to apologize for him. Undeterred by Evelyn's constant rejection, Thaw persisted for years, and eventually, to Evelyn's eternal woe, he wore her down. Worn down by his unequal devotion, Evelyn finally agreed to marry her own sadistic attacker, Harry Thaw. They tied the knot on April 5th, 1905, but as a sign that this was no celebratory affair, the bride wore black. In the early days of her marriage, Evelyn hoped that Thaw had changed. Sadly, she placed her confidence in the wrong man. The faint glimmers of marital bliss faded once it became obvious that Harry Thaw hadn't changed a bit. He was still as obsessed as ever with Stanford White and his past transgressions. Wildly, this is how Evelyn became embroidered in a feud between her two guilty lovers. Thaw had White followed, and White had Thaw followed. It was a demented rivalry, and in the end, it came to a fatal standoff. Evelyn became Thaw's pawn in an attempt to knock Stanford White from his gilded tower. Thaw wasn't just angry over the way White had harmed Evelyn. He also resented White's power in New York, especially because the high-class community never accepted Thaw. Taking possession of Evelyn was a power move. She was near and dear to White, and he used her to exact revenge. When Thaw found out that Stanford White had paid for Evelyn's dental work, he decided to undo the improvements made. He sent her back to the dentist to have her teeth ruined, all to spite White. Soon enough, Thaw's control over Evelyn was all-encompassing. He demanded that she keep an eye out for White at all times and to notify him immediately if she ever saw him. He demanded she call White the Beast. After a year of waiting in vain to travel, Evelyn finally got her wish. Her husband announced a grand trip to Europe, their journey beginning with a pit stop in New York. It sounded resplendent, dinner and a show and then a ship bound for new shores. But the play they had tickets to was playing at none other than Stanford White's Madison Square Garden. If Evelyn thought this was just a coincidence, she'd soon be proven wrong. On the night of the play, Evelyn noticed her husband's odd behavior. He was drinking profusely and sweating beneath a long black overcoat. At curtain call, she was happy to see that White wasn't in his usual seat. She wanted to avoid him at all costs, as her husband was sure to make a scene. But then the elevator doors opened, and her heart instantly sank. Stanford White waltzed confidently into the theater, oblivious to Thaw's plan. Distressed at the sight of her old love, Evelyn asked Thaw if they could leave discreetly. But when she arrived at the elevator doors, her husband was nowhere in sight. To her horror, she turned to see him walking in the opposite direction, straight toward Stanford White. Drawing a pistol from his coat, Thaw took aim at his nemesis and shot him point blank. 3 deadly blasts rang through the theater. With bullets to the teeth, the eye, and the shoulder, White passed instantly. Smiling and victorious, Thaw gave up his weapon and said, "I did it because he ruined my wife." Because she was the center of the twisted love triangle, Evelyn became the star witness and the face of the trial that ensued. Her defamatory information on Stanford White was evidence for her husband's defense, a plea of temporary insanity, or what was called a brainstorm. Purported as an act of chivalry, his moment of madness serviced his wife's honor. But in order for this to work, Thaw's team had to make the jury despise Stanford White. Evelyn took the stand for both of her husband's trials. During a time when assault and even intimate relations were taboo, her testimonial became scandalous fodder for the masses. This destroyed her to the very core, mentally and emotionally. Until then, her attack by Stanford White had remained a dark secret, and now everything was out in the open. But she had no choice. She completely depended on Thaw's fortune to stay afloat. When the second trial commenced, Thaw had no choice but to plead insanity. Too much evidence surrounding his character had surfaced since his last trial, and this defense was the only way for him to escape the electric chair. This time, he was found not guilty, with the judge sentencing him to life at the state hospital for the criminally insane. But even then, Evelyn couldn't escape the clutches of her psychotic husband. From the confines of the hospital, Thaw had Evelyn followed, her every movement tracked and reported. And then, in 1910, Evelyn gave birth to her first child, a son named Russell William Thaw. She claimed to have conceived Russell during a visit shared with Thaw, but for the rest of his life, he strongly denied paternity. After everything she sacrificed for him, Evelyn soon learned that marrying into the Thaw family had been a monumental mistake. Thaw's mother despised Evelyn. She resented her daughter-in-law for her lowly station and hated that her son chose to marry so far beneath them. Mother Thaw afforded Evelyn no mercy and gave her a pitiful allowance, mere crumbs compared to the riches she once enjoyed. This forced her to crawl to her incarcerated husband and beg for more money, just so she could pay her rent. Soon enough, she hit a breaking point. When Evelyn finally realized that the Thaws would never provide her with a stable living, everything clicked into place. She knew what she had to do. Evelyn scandalized society by beginning to testify against her own husband at his sanity hearings. It was the only way she could get back at Thaw and hopefully make him angry enough to release her. Thankfully, Evelyn's plan worked. Thaw filed for divorce, but even this didn't guarantee her a happy life. After her divorce in 1915, Evelyn married Jack Clifford. He was a promising dancer, and together they worked on a stage act. But Evelyn's identity still molded in the backlash of Thaw's trial, and Clifford had a hard time living in his wife's infamous shadow. In the end, he left her in 1918. Alone once again, Evelyn had to find a way to provide for herself. In the 1920s, Evelyn became a proprietor of a Manhattan tea room. Sadly, These turned out to be some of her darkest years. Addiction became her constant companion as she grappled with alcoholism and the temptation of morphine. And after being fired from a dancing gig in 1926, the sadness became too much to bear. She took a swig of disinfectant and tried to end it all. Luckily, Evelyn pulled through her attempt. She moved away from New York and its many ghosts, setting up shop in Los Angeles, California. She was an artist now, a sculptor, and she flourished as an instructor at the Grant Beach School of Arts and Crafts. Today, Evelyn's face is instantly recognizable, and while most aren't aware of her scandalous history, it is a face difficult to forget. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything.